So back in the 80s and 90s, it was extremely common for video game publishers to order changes to be made to games in the West, usually for the worse. This was for a large factor of reasons. During the NES era, Nintendo of America didn't allow developers to use their own mapper chips, as they handled all of the cartridge manufacturing for the system. So a lot of games that used unique mapper chips and thus had space for extra graphics or added more sound channels on the Famicom in Japan were heavily cut down for a Western release, or just not released at all. Another problem was that while Japan lacked a video game rental market, the rental market was a huge part of the gaming experience in North America. So to combat this and get people to actually buy games, developers would increase the difficulty of games to prevent people from being able to beat them in a week, which ended up making the game less fun and had the opposite effect of making you want to avoid purchasing the game altogether. Another problem was censorship, obviously. The most annoying problem to me personally, though, was the fear that games wouldn't do well overseas without having a complete art style shift, basically insulting the original artist's vision. This usually only extended to the box art though, so it wasn't that bad, but sometimes it affected the games. Like, if the character didn't have bushy eyebrows, no one would take the whimsical game about the star with stretchy arms seriously. They wanted to change games to appeal to an audience that wouldn't even like the game to begin with, because the edgelord who's insecure about playing whimsical games audience is apparently the widest demographic. Thankfully, these Japanese companies have learned from this mistake and have never tried to appeal to that demographic ever again. So, a lot of games were butchered when being brought over from Japan. You hear it all the time, games were better in Japan. But sometimes Japanese games would actually be improved when reaching Western shores. And today I want to take a look at a few of these examples because shockingly, no one else has ever really bothered to cover this subject. But first, I want to thank you for sponsoring this video. Thanks for watching. Well, to kick off this topic, why don't we talk about Tetris? But Tetris isn't a Japanese game. Yes, Tetris is a Soviet game, but I want to talk about specific versions of Tetris. The multiple different versions of Tetris for Nintendo's main 8-bit home console. First, let's talk about the Japanese version. Tetris for the Famicom, created by Bulletproof Software in 1988. This version of Tetris is pretty weak. You rotate the pieces one way by pressing down on the D-pad, and drop them by pressing the A button, which just doesn't work as well as the control scheme later Tetris games would use. There's also an unskippable score tally at the end of every level, and it's long. The levels also reset at the end, so it's pretty much impossible to have a fun play session playing on the lower speeds. The biggest problem though is that your only faster dropping option is to do hard drops, meaning that a lot of the time, you have no choice but to place pieces in bad spots unless you sacrifice your score and sanity, waiting for them to come down themselves. That being said, if you didn't know better, it's fine. I mean, it's Tetris, but it's not a good version of it. It was popular in Japan though. The version the Western world got for the NES, published by Nintendo, is much better. All of these problems are gone and it makes a huge difference. It does quite literally everything better than the Famicom version. The only advantage the Famicom version has is having Technotris. That's it. And this version never released for the Famicom in Japan. However, a new challenger appears. The unlicensed version of Tetris for the NES by Tengen. It has all of the best features of the Nintendo version, but also a host of other modes, including multiplayer, which the Nintendo version doesn't even have. It does have a score tally like the Famicom version though. Unfortunately, due to all of the legal complications surrounding the rights to the game that I'm not going to get into here, it's incredibly rare. But since it'll never be re-released anyways, it's completely ethical to play on an emulator. Some people prefer the Nintendo version, and while I do think it's a little better than Tengen's version aesthetically, dude, Tengen's version has so much more to offer. Some people, on the other hand, don't like, or in the case of the speedrunning community, do like the Nintendo version because of its scoring bugs. But either way you slice it, I think everyone can agree that the two NES versions are vastly superior to the Japanese Famicom version. Unfortunately though, while I think the NES versions are the better versions of a game simply titled Tetris on the platform, Japan still got the best 8-bit Tetris game and we didn't. Tetris 2 plus Bombliss is easily the best version of Tetris for Nintendo's 8-bit systems. It has everything. It also has music composed by Koichi Sugiyama. Oof. It's pretty good music, but you know. It actually has a fairly star-studded development team though. The game was created by Chunsoft, creators of the Dragon Quest series, with Creatures and future Pokemon Company co-founder Tsunekazu Ishihara producing the game. And supposedly Xevious and Tower of Druaga creator Masanobu Endo and Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto assisted with the game. In fact, the genesis of this game's creation was these people's dissatisfaction with the original Famicom Tetris. After this, BPS kept releasing some absolutely incredible versions of Tetris for Nintendo platforms, including Super Tetris 2 plus Bombliss, Tetris Battle Gaiden, and the confusingly named Super Tetris 3, only for the Super Famicom in Japan. So I guess covering this series doesn't really help with the narrative of this video. So I guess I should cover what's likely the most famous example of this phenomenon: Super Mario Bros. 2. And before we begin, I need to correct a very annoying misconception about this game. So everyone knows that the US version of Super Mario Bros. 2 was actually a heavily modified version of a Japanese game called Doki Doki Panic. For some reason, people gravitate towards the subtitle when the game's full name is Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic, but whatever. But some people like to add an addendum to that and say that the game was actually confirmed to have always originally been a Mario game. This seems to be a misinterpretation of a statement made by director Kensuke Tanabe, where he said the developers were told to make a Mario-like game, but not a Mario game. Remember, this was 1986. The term platformer didn't really exist for this type of game yet. Doki Doki Panic was always intended to be a tie-in to Fuji TV's Yume Kojo 87 event. In fact, the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2 came out only 9 months after the original game had come out and before Yume Kojo, so it's absurd to think that Nintendo was making two Super Mario Bros. Follow-ups at the same time. But about that original Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2, it's such a strange game. This is the hardest I think I've ever seen a game misunderstand the appeal of its predecessor. It takes the mechanics from the first game, but it's designed in the exact opposite way, under the guise of it being an evolution for more experienced players. But throwing out the core appeal of the original game is not an evolution. The team behind the game seemed to think that people liked the original for the mechanics alone, when its real strength was its level design. For the most part, it had very good progression that moved players in the right path, while still giving them many different opportunities for how to approach the game. This game throws all of that out. The difficulty curve is basically non-existent, and for most levels, there's one correct way to approach them. It's proof that good mechanics don't mean anything if there's no substance outside of that. If I'm being honest though, as a game for people who had squeezed everything they could out of Super Mario Bros. And were looking for something to challenge them, it's not that bad. But that was the wrong direction to go. That's not what a game entitled Super Mario Bros. 2 should have tried to be. It's not supposed to be a game for a niche audience, it's supposed to be a sequel to Super Mario Bros. They were more so following the trend of games like Super Xevious and Championship Loadrunner that are mechanically the same as the original game, but made unfairly difficult for only the most experienced players. The thing is, those games weren't really billed as sequels. Super Mario Bros. 3 feels like a more suitable follow-up to the original game. With that game, they managed to create a game that has something new to offer for everyone regardless of skill level, while still keeping the basic gameplay of the original game intact. But I will admit, I'm viewing this through an overly modern lens. Back in 1986, people didn't really know what to expect out of a video game sequel. The number 2 in this case didn't mean the type of things we're accustomed to expect now, it just meant that they made another one. So it's not really a game worth getting upset about. But that still doesn't mean that that modern lens isn't valid, and I'm someone who personally chooses to judge games based on how much they succeed or fail at what they set out to do in general, rather than giving them grace off of one merit they may have. And I still think the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2 is a mediocre game, because it still sets out to be a sequel and fails miserably. And even when it comes to being a super difficult Mario game, it fails at that too, because I still think they could have done that without most of the levels heavily restricting the player's ability to approach them how they want, something that was already established in and the strong suit of the first game. It isn't all negatives though, it has some engine, sound, and graphical enhancements, but that doesn't matter when the level design sucks. And a lot of the levels for this game are actually modified from the original levels from the arcade versus Super Mario Bros. If you want a better experience with these enhancements, then play Nintendo's other Fuji TV licensed game besides Yume Kojo, All Night Nippon Super Mario Bros., which is a recreation of the original, though be forewarned, it still does have levels from the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2 mixed in. Anyways, the US Super Mario Bros. 2 does a much better job at following the original game up. Instead of trying to be the same thing but with less broad appeal, it tries to be something different while still keeping that same appeal. I do think though that Super Mario Bros. 3 is a better follow-up to the original game than either of these two games. That being said, the US Super Mario Bros. 2 does such a good job at following up the original game for a game that wasn't even meant to do that. It's a platformer with a surreal fantasy setting and good level design. Despite originally being a different game and being incredibly mechanically different from its predecessor, Super Mario Bros. 2 USA still has all of the most important aspects of a Mario game. And Yume Kojo had some Mario elements anyways, like the POW block. But not only is it better than the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2, it improves a lot of things from Yume Kojo as well. Though I don't have the time to list these things out, and it's a lot of minor stuff like, oh no.
Oh, no, that's unfortunate. That is unfortunate. Oh.
I think the reason the game feels so right for a Mario game, outside of just sharing those important aspects I just talked about, is that it was still made by the original team. You know how a lot of early NES games have very crappy or weird translations? That's because these games weren't handled in the way you'd think they were. It was rare for games to be handed to an overseas team to modify, though they usually did send an English speaker over to Japan to help localize text-heavy stuff like RPGs. Usually, it was cheaper and easier to just have the programmers that already had experience with the game's code modify it for the Western release. The original Yume Kojo team, including Shigeru Miyamoto, worked on the US release of Super Mario Bros. 2. The idea behind changing Yume Kojo into a Mario game actually saved the game from falling into obscurity, as it was a licensed game intended to promote a one-time event, and this allowed Nintendo to re-release the game in Japan as Super Mario USA, which is an incredibly dumb name, but whatever. Like, what other game is named after the real-world circumstances behind its release? Aside from yearly titles. But this game is pretty much accepted as a mainline Mario game in Japan, and for good reason. It's had quite the influence on the series as well. It reminds me of a similar situation with the game Gunhead for the PC Engine. That game was originally licensed from a crappy Japanese sci-fi film that it barely had anything to do with, but when it was brought over to the TurboGrafx 16 in the West, it was renamed to Blazing Lasers, Since barely anyone cares about the film but people love the game, every time it's been re-released, even in Japan, it's the North American version with the Blazing Lasers title screen. So, Super Mario Bros. 2 is a case of being a better game than the completely different one it shares its name with, and an improvement over the original Japanese title it's based on, and I think that's pretty neat. Speaking of Mario, I actually think the other 3 classic games were improved in the West as well, in a way. I think the North American box arts are much better than the Japanese ones. The Japanese ones aren't bad, mind you, but they're a little cluttered. The American ones get rid of all of that redundant information, but they didn't make the insulting move of changing the art altogether. Well, except for the first game's box art, which I guess I can see someone making an argument for the Japanese version being better. Ironically, I think the Japanese box arts for both Super Mario Bros. 2 and Super Mario USA are much better than the US Super Mario Bros. 2's box art. Guess it can't win at everything. Also, I know that Super Mario Bros. 3 was changed a lot for its Western release. I mean, it came out 2 years late, but I'm not enough of an expert on the changes to really comment on them. But the general consensus seems to be that the US version is better. Actually, I'm still not done with Mario though. Let me propose some hypotheticals to you. Do you want to play both Duck Hunt and Super Mario Bros. On the Famicom? Well, you gotta buy 2 cartridges, buddy. Do you want to play both Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. on the Famicom? Well, you gotta buy 2 cartridges, buddy. Do you want to play both Super Mario Collection and Super Mario World on the Super Famicom? Well, you gotta buy 2 cartridges, buddy. I could go on, but in the US, you could get all of these pairs of games in single cartridge value packs. It seems this was almost never done in Japan. I would love to know if there are any more value packs like that in Japan, and why they never did stuff like this as often. It's a very strange phenomenon, and an aspect of the Western gaming industry that was much better than in Japan. Weirdly, there's an example of this happening and it being the only release of the game in the US, and for good reason. The Japanese PC Engine port of R-Type tried to keep everything from the arcade version intact and ended up being split into 2. However, the North American TurboGrafx-16 release included the entire game on 1 HuCard, and Japanese fans never got the leisure of experiencing the game that way. But let's move on to more traditional examples of this. None of this 3-game comparison crap like with Tetris and Super Mario Bros. 2. No vague phenomenon like value packs. Let's just talk about a Western release that's better than the Japanese original. How about Mega Man 2? Okay, well, getting the elephant in the room out of the way. Yeah, the Western versions of these games aren't winning any box art competitions, but I think a lot of the elements of the Mega Man games in the West are better. While Mega is a terrible name, and I prefer it when they call him Rock worldwide, the name Mega Man is much better than Rockman. That just sounds like he throws rocks. The musical theme naming doesn't really work as well with the alias because Mega Man is a separate entity from Roll. Also, Proto Man is better than Blues. Once again, like Rock, it's hard to ignore the meaning the word has outside of the musical theme naming. He's literally the opposite of Blue. But I don't know, you could argue that Blues coming before Rock and Roll is pretty clever, while Dr. Light permanently naming his first creation Proto Man is kind of insulting. I guess I can go either way. But I haven't heard anyone argue that Bass and Trouble isn't a better name for the duo than Forte and Gospel. I mean, that's just a million times better. The names actually relate to each other. I don't know why they didn't use their original names, Baroque and Crash, over there. They're good puns on Rock and Rush. But I'm kinda getting off track. For the most part, outside of character names, these games aren't really changed that much outside of Japan. And the Western Mega Man games can usually be considered worse versions purely based off the huge discrepancy in quality between the box arts. But Mega Man 2 is the outlier. For this release, they added a lower difficulty option. though it's only called normal, and I find it to be a much more enjoyable experience. Now, I didn't just want to include games because they were made easier in the West in this video, but I think it greatly benefits Mega Man 2. Approachability is a huge part of the appeal of Mega Man, and I find most of these games still disappoint me on that front, usually only having one good weapon. While Mega Man 2 doesn't fix Rockman 2's problem of there only being one good weapon, and there being situations where certain weapons are mandatory, it does allow for more flexibility when choosing boss order. If you don't care about Metal Blade, that is. In Rockman 2 in difficult mode, it's pretty much impossible to jump straight into the game aiming to beat one of the stronger bosses, but in Mega Man 2's normal mode, every enemy and boss takes more damage while you take less, plus they drop items way more, maybe a bit too much sometimes, but for a game where you can get stuck if you don't have enough weapon energy, it's really useful. And despite the game not originally being designed with it in mind, it feels way more balanced and enjoyable. It feels like Rockman 2 in difficult mode pushed things precisely past the point of being annoying. Some annoying enemy behaviors are also changed, and I find that to make the game more enjoyable as well. While these changes don't get rid of all of the inherent problems, like I said, there's only one good weapon and certain weapons are mandatory, and a lot of the game's BS trial and error design can't really be changed. I think these changes make the game feel closer to what a Mega Man game should be in terms of difficulty. Absurdly challenging, but not pushing things one step too far like these games usually do. I think this game's levels, despite being filled with absurd and annoying trial and error, are really easy to learn, even in Rockman 2 or difficult mode. I can't really explain it, but every other Mega Man game feels like its stages are just slightly too long for me to get a grasp on, even in the quote-unquote easier ones. This game's levels feel just right in terms of length, and the addition of normal mode really helps smooth that learning curve. Even as someone who values approachability and hates trial and error gameplay that straight up completely punishes you for not knowing what's coming up, and I'm talking about the level design itself, I don't mind these games forcing you to experiment with weapons. I find that Mega Man 2, when played on normal mode, is a really solid experience in spite of those things, even when compared to other games in the series. That being said, it does do one thing worse than the Japanese version in both difficulties, and that's the slower text speed, though it isn't exactly great in Rockman 2 either. But Rockman 2 is the preferred version by speedrunners solely because of this. One weird change they made is changing Clashman's name to Crashman. For the longest time, the weebs would defend the Clashman name, but Mega Man's creator Akira Kitamura himself said that it's supposed to be Crashman. Like I said, localized versions of games were usually handled by the original teams in this time period, so this may have actually been a sort of fix on the Japanese team's part, but who knows. All of the international divisions of Capcom have always had a strong relationship with each other, and all play a big role in their games. Capcom's not necessarily a Japanese company like the other Japanese video game companies, despite the primary creative work being done by Japanese developers, if you know what I mean. However, every time Capcom has remade Mega Man 2, they've stripped out the difficulty selection feature. Mega Man The Wily Wars doesn't have it due to it only being made with Rockman 2 in mind. And Mega Man Anniversary Collection's version of the game was based on the Rockman Complete Works version released only in Japan, and thus doesn't have it. I was going to include a long section about stuff about this game that's unrelated to the topic of this video, particularly its growing hate-dom, but I might save it for a video about games that went from being overrated to being overhated. Let me know if you would like to see that. Anyways, Mega Man 2 is a fun game, and I think it's an improvement over Rockman 2. Now I want to talk about another larger topic. In 1989, Sega stopped supporting the Master System, or Mark III, in Japan, with its last game being Bomber Raid. released in February of that year. It's pretty obvious why they did this. They had just launched the Mega Drive and they wanted to focus on that instead of the Master System, which failed to gain an audience that could help it compete against the Famicom and PC Engine. This makes the Master System a weird case of a console that has an extremely small Japanese library compared to the rest of the world, with only 83 of its 315 games releasing there. It's also because of this that Japan didn't get the chance to play some of its most popular games, like Golden Axe Warrior, Alex Kidd in Shinobi World, the second game to be titled Wonder Boy 3, and Sonic the Hedgehog. Actually, they did get to experience those last two, but they were only on the Sega Game Gear, which received better support over there. The Game Gear is very similar to the Master System in terms of capabilities, but there's one big difference. It has a much smaller resolution. So when Japanese players finally got a hold of these games, they were forced to play them with heavy screen crunch. So Japan either only got the weaker versions of these games or didn't get them at all. Of course, after a while, North America stopped receiving Master System games too, and all of the ones released after 1991 were exclusive to Europe and Brazil. What's really depressing about this is the fact that a lot of these games were developed in Japan, but they wouldn't even get released over there. They were making games that people back home couldn't really experience or could only experience in a weaker format. This shockingly didn't affect the quality of the games that much though. This led to some funny situations, like Japan getting the sequel to Golden Axe Warrior on the Game Gear, but they didn't even get the original game. I think the games that benefited most from Master System support though were the Sonic games. No one wants to play a Sonic game with screen crunch. Whenever Sega re-releases these games, they refuse to release the Master System versions, which sucks because everyone agrees that they're just better. Sonic 1 is better on the Master System and even looks better. The Game Gear version of Sonic's sprite looks like his eyes are melting into his nose. Sonic 2, being insanely difficult, especially for a Sonic game, benefits from having a bigger view. Sonic Chaos's music also just sounds a bit better on the Master System, but unfortunately it's clear that this was when the games started being made primarily for the Game Gear, as the game's ridiculously easy even on the Game Gear, and can be 100%ed in less than an hour. Also, given that the game was only released in the West, the Master System title screen uses the Mohawk butt brow design for Sonic. Also, there's a Brazil-only Master System port of Sonic Blast that clearly wasn't optimized, but hey, if you want to play Sonic Blast, don't. It's really a shame that Japanese players couldn't experience the best versions of these games, or some of them at all, but given how unpopular the Master System was there, it's likely that only a dozen people would even want to play them. The only support the Master System got in Japan that was better than the rest of the world was the FM sound unit, and I guess backwards compatibility with the SG-1000. Alright, to cap things off, here's the mandatory section. So I said earlier that RPGs usually did have more involvement from the Western publishers when being localized, as they needed to put more care into them with their heavy amounts of text. But sometimes they would go above and beyond. When Nintendo of America saw the Dragon Quest series' ridiculously huge popularity in Japan, they wanted a piece of that pie. So when they re-released the first game to NES 3 years after its initial release, the developers went all out remaking the game. In fact, the localization's code was apparently done by future Nintendo president Satoru Iwata himself, while he was still working at HAL. Okay, up front, I need to say yes, the name Dragon Warrior is nowhere near as good as Dragon Quest, and the artwork doesn't compare to the original Akira Toriyama artwork, though it's actually not that bad. However, the rest of the game is improved exponentially to an absurd degree. The original Famicom version used very stick figure-like sprites that only faced in one position, similar to those of the Ultima games, while the NES version had fully animated ones. If you wanted to talk to someone in the original Famicom version, you had to choose a direction. But this needlessly obtuse feature was removed from the NES release, though unfortunately, the rest of the needlessly obtuse interface was kept intact despite being incredibly dated at this point. The biggest fix, however, was removing the password feature and allowing for real battery saves. The actual localization wasn't a slouch either. While they did make the covers a bit edgier, they kept the whimsical nature of these games intact. And all of the text is written in a very exaggerated form of Old English, and it gives the game a lot of character and charm. Dragon Warrior 2 didn't really change much from Dragon Quest II, other than replacing one of the most infamous password systems in video game history with a battery save feature, and lowering the difficulty by increasing experience given by each enemy and lowering their hit points. Dragon Warrior 3, while it contained some censorship, also went above and beyond, including creating a whole new cutscene intro for the game and giving the father character a unique sprite. Unfortunately, Dragon Warrior 4 didn't really improve much and was mostly just censored from the original. Obviously, the biggest weakness that these versions of the games have compared to the Japanese originals is their performance, and they didn't become an international sensation like they did in Japan. After the series failed to gain traction in the US after 4 attempts, we didn't even get either of the Super Famicom games, so this story kind of still ends on a downer. And more infamously, Koichi Sugiyama heavily hampered the quality of the later games in the West. This series is in a really depressing state right now, and I think it should be laid to rest. I wouldn't say this for most series, but it's definitely one that needs to just stick with the retro re-release and compilation treatment instead of being zombified. I know that he wasn't the creator, but Dragon Quest just can't be Dragon Quest now that Akira Toriyama is gone. But now I'm handing the platform over to you. I would love to hear more examples of this phenomenon that I didn't mention. Let me know if you agree or disagree with my picks. Respectfully, of course. I know there are some I didn't include, but a lot of them aren't that interesting and just boil down to they made the game easier or something like that. Like Ninja Gaiden 2. I also didn't want to include anything that has only one improvement and that's really it. So I didn't include Zanac just because the music is better. I've also known that there's also the example of Power Blazer and Power Blade, but I'm not familiar enough with the games themselves to try to learn it in 2 weeks to cover in this video. Sorry. Let me know if you would like to see more videos like this. If you like this video, consider checking out my video on the Lost 70s arcade games. They're more interesting than you think. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to my ever so kind patrons. I hope you all have a great day.